Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles. Even though I haven't been outside that much, but the brief moments that I've had outside have been very nice. Okay, couple things that I want us to cover today. We'll wait just about 30 more seconds before we get going, but I have a couple of things that I want to share with you specifically today. So, okay, let's do it. Why not? Hello, welcome. First, I'll go through all the usual, my weekly ritual of going over Zoom. We'll do the blessing, and then I want to share a couple things before we get to the text, this week's text. So, of course, on this platform, you can virtually raise your hand under the participants list. So when we get to the point where we will be sharing questions and comments, you can virtually raise your hand and I can call on you that way. Of course, you can use the Q&A or the chat box, though the chat box, honestly, it's not as easy for me to multitask and follow along when questions are put in there. So if you're chatting with one another and you want to share thoughts, please do that and I'll make sure to look through them. But if you have a specific question, either please raise your hand if you want to verbally say it, or you can put it in the Q&A section and we can get to that when we get to the Q&A. All right. Okay, let's start with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this 16th opportunity to engage in the study of Torah together, or in this case, Talmud. Okay, few things to cover. One, I want to show you something that when I saw it reminded me of the text that we studied last week, because if you remember last week, we studied the story of Honi, the circle maker, and how he fell asleep. He sees a man who's planting a tree. He falls asleep for 70 years. He wakes up and he's no longer relevant in a way, and he deals with what it means to no longer be relevant. So I saw this trailer for a movie that's coming up, and how could I not think of the text that we studied and how I feel like this is purely this movie. And I feel like since I'm in LA, I need to find out who wrote it and who produced it. I haven't done that kind of research yet, and find out if they linked back and if the premise for the story is at all related to Honi the circle maker and the man who sleeps for 70 years. So this is just part of the trailer for An American Pickle coming out soon. So I thought I would show this to you because I think it's pretty.
Als ik arbeidsjaar in school een weerreich.
Wie reich?
Zo reich. Als ik zo opzollen mijn eigen met zijn.
In old country of Slupska, I am ditch digger. As far as jobs in Slups go, it's pretty good. We are the Greenbaums, and we have American dream. I find good job in pickle factory. Sarah, I make this vow. 100 years, our family will prosper. And then one day, everything changed.
It's been 100 years. The pickle brine preserved him perfectly.
You're too old to lose it.
The world has changed. Everyone I know is gone.
You were able to track down a great-grandson.
Greenbaum. Greenbaum. This is nuts.
Walk past the cafe, but you don't eat when you live to.
Your parents, where are they? They passed away. It was a car crash. He will tell me everything of their deaths, how their bodies died, their faces as the life left. We will bond over our pain.
Oh no, love, you're not alone.
Okay. So you can go and watch the whole trailer, but a man falls into pickle brine in a factory and wakes up 100 years later perfectly preserved, and he meets his great-grandson or his grandson and goes through a whole journey, great-grandson, I think, and they develop a whole pickle company together. But another way in which our tradition yet again finds its way into pop culture. So for me, I've always loved the fact that our stories whether it's the Bible or the Talmud, have figured out ways of weaving themselves into popular culture. And so this is the newest example. It's coming out in a few weeks, so you can definitely check that out if you have HBO Max. Okay, so that was the callback to last week's. And then now today is actually a minor fast day. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, the 17th of Tammuz. This today kicks off 3 weeks of contemplation and reflection for the Jewish people that really comes to the climax on Tisha B'Av in 3 weeks, the 9th of Av, which is the only other 24-hour fast day besides Yom Kippur that we have during the year. There are a variety of minor fast days, including this one. So for today, for example, those who are commemorating the 17th of Tammuz, from dawn until sundown, there is no eating or drinking. And so I wanted to just give you a sense of this holiday, since most people in the liberal settings, number one, don't know about it, or number two, don't commemorate it. And I urge you, even today, even though it's already 1 in the afternoon, there's still plenty of daylight left. Think about if there's a way that you can mark this day with some kind of ritual. So before you even understand that, if you're going to do a ritual, you should understand why. So I just want to share with you first the text that is really used as the baseline for the 17th of Tammuz. It comes from the Mishnah, and if you remember, all the stories that we've been studying come from the Talmud, which are built upon the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was the law code from around 200 CE. And so this is a passage from the Mishnah that is used to mark why today is so significant as a fast day, because it's thought that on this day in the Jewish calendar, there were many calamities that befell the Jewish people throughout history. And if you go to Tisha B'Av, and if you were to search Tisha B'Av chronology, Jewish destruction, you would find a whole list of things that have happened throughout history that are related to pogroms and destruction of the Jewish community and Judaism throughout history. So this begins that period of reflection on all the bad things that have happened to us. And I think today, and the reason I want to urge you to think about if there's one ritual that you can do to mark today as the setup for the next 3 weeks, and then we will be commemorating Tisha B'Av as a community on the evening of Tisha B'Av. I think it's a Thursday night. I should have thought to remember the date and shared it with you, but you'll find out more information about it. It's in 3 weeks. But to really think about, what does it mean to have a minor fast day? Many people only fast on Yom Kippur, and we know that that's a day in which, yes, you're sitting in synagogue for most of the day, or this year you're going to be sitting at home. And that's a time where we can be really reflective, where we're putting aside our physicality and we're focusing on our spirituality. And today is a minor version of that. And so you can see this as both a way to mark the beginning of 3 weeks in which our traditional community is commemorating all the things that have gone bad for our community over the course of history. Or you can also see this as also a prequel to Yom Kippur. And what does it mean to not just walk into Yom Kippur and fast for the first time since last Yom Kippur at that point, but what does this mean to do a little bit of exercise of ritual? And as with all things, just like what we're doing with Talmud study, thank you, July 29th. Just like we're doing with Talmud study, is we're trying to exercise new ways in which we use our brain, and creating new ritual for yourself, for your family, is a very important and powerful Jewish tool for us to use. And so I really want you to think about that, and maybe it'll come up in the conversation. But even if you were to fast for a couple of hours today, or you were only going to drink water for a certain period of time, or you are going to read a certain passage, whatever it may be, I do urge you to try and figure out a way for you to mark this occasion. And also then you can say, you honored and celebrated, celebration is the wrong word, but mourned with the Jewish people on the 17th of Tammuz. Okay, with that, let's just look briefly at the text so you understand what I'm talking about. This is from the Mishnah, Ta'anit 4:6. Remember, we have studied things from Ta'anit before. That's the one that deals with fast days. It's a whole section about fast days. The story of Honi, the circle maker, was from Ta'anit. from the Talmudic understanding of the building on the Mishnah, right? So Ta'anit deals with fast days. Sometimes it's about when there's no rain, and in other times it's for situations such as this. So these were the 5 events that happened to our ancestors on the 17th of Tammuz, and 5 on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. On the 17th of Tammuz, the tablets were shattered. That's referring to Moses coming down from the mountain, Mount Sinai. He sees all the Jewish people there with the golden calf, and he smashes the first set of tablets, right? So it's marking the first thing that it's marking is that disappointment in building up a society and a culture built on Jewish values, and recognizing the fact that not everyone is abiding by those, right? And so right there, we have the first destructive act that takes place, and that the tablets were shattered. The second is that the tamid, the daily offerings, were canceled. That's referring to the daily sacrifices that were done at the temple in Jerusalem. And that's referring to, if you don't really have the background here, but there was a shortage of sheep. So they couldn't actually do the daily sacrifices. So that's the second thing. The third is that the walls of the city of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans. So this is really the beginning of the path that led eventually to the Romans destroying the second temple. And then the Roman general Apostomos burned the Torah and placed an idol in the temple. And so it also refers to this very overt sign of desecrating Jewish tradition by this Roman general. Okay, and then it goes on in the same passage to talk about then Tisha B'Av, which comes up in 3 weeks, where it was decreed that our ancestors should not enter the land. The temple was destroyed the first and the second time, the first and the second temple. Beitar was captured and the city was plowed up. And when Av enters, they limit their rejoicing. And that refers to the fact that starting on the first of Av, there is an even more intense period, especially within more traditional communities, of how people act. Right now, for these next 3 periods, some people don't cut their hair. There are some restrictions, and then those restrictions get even more intense from the 1st of Av to the 9th of Av. But today is marking a significant number of things that have been attempts to destroy the Jewish people. And of course, we're still here, thank God. But we do have these moments throughout our year where we recognize the need to mourn. And I think given what we're going through in our society now, today is a little mini piece of what I think Tisha B'Av really can be for our community in a few weeks, is a real day of mourning and loss and recognition of the lament. We read Lamentations, this idea of how can we say Echa, Lamentations begin, how? Like, how is this possible? What is going on? What are we dealing with? And sometimes there are those moments where we have to answer that question with hope and optimism. And there are moments where we just have to sit in that feeling of depression, of sadness, of feeling deflated. And Tisha B'Av gives us that moment to just sit with it. Anyone who's gone to Jerusalem, you've gone to the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av, people crying, wailing for the destruction of the temples, of course, historically, but also so much of the pain and anguish that we hold within our souls as the Jewish people. So that's a little bit about the 17th of Tammuz, which is today. And again, I urge you to think about if there's a little way in which you can mark this day, in whatever way that feels comfortable to you, but that can also show some recognition of what this day is supposed to represent. Okay, now that we've covered that, now let's move on to the text that I brought for you today. It is going to be a text that we are going to continue with next week. Where we are in the Talmud on Shabbat 30b and 31a are a bunch of stories about Hillel and Shammai, and it continues next week right after this passage with the famous passage of Hillel and Shammai, which we'll share and study together next week. The hint to that is the one line that most people know is, give me the whole Torah on 1 foot. So Hillel does that on 1 foot, but there's more around just that one line. So we're gonna look at that story next week, but this comes before that. And so I figured, not only for context, but also because I think this is also a really important lesson that's being taught through this story, that we should study this one. Okay, so I'll read through it. This one, it's a pretty straightforward passage. It's not like some of the passages we've read where we really take apart every single word. This one is not necessarily like that. So more we're going to be thinking about the overarching theme, contrasting Shammai with Hillel. We're not seeing how Shammai would have acted in the situation. We can assume Shammai would have acted different, but we're really looking at how does Hillel respond, and how is Hillel a model for how we would need to respond to someone. And I called it answering a fool, acknowledging a fool, answering a fool. It's a little bit of a push. I don't want to get caught up in whether this person is a fool or not. It might actually be better to see him as a troll, thinking about how trolls are used online these days. But I want you to keep in mind, how does he respond? Does Hillel have a responsibility to respond? And when he does respond, how is it that he's responding that the Talmud holds him up as the ideal version of how we should deal with situations like this? And then, of course, think about how this relates to your own life and what we're dealing with today. For me, this came up because there have been many times where I've looked into the TV and I've wanted to scream, "You fool!" Where there are moments where I'm looking at leadership or other people around the country doing things that I completely disagree with, or I feel like are putting people or themselves in harm's way, and I want to cry out and I want to get really upset and angry. And this story is a nice reminder for me, and is about what we should all be striving for in some ways. Okay, with that, let's look at the story. So we'll read through it once, really, just straight through, and then we'll go back and break it down a little. The sages taught in a Baraita, a person should always be patient like Hillel and not impatient like Shammai. It once happened that two men made a wager with each other, saying, "He who goes and makes Hillel angry shall receive 400 zuz." Said one, "I will go and incense him." That day it was the Sabbath eve, and Hillel was washing his head. He went, passed by the door of his house, and called out, "Is Hillel here? Is Hillel here?" Thereupon he robed and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you require?" "I have a question to ask," said he. "Ask, my son," he prompted. Thereupon he asked, "Why are the heads of the Babylonians round?" "My son, you have asked a great question," replied he, "because they have no skillful midwives." He departed, tarried a while, returned and called out, "Is Hillel here? Is Hillel here?" He robed and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you require?" "I have a question to ask," he said. "Ask, my son," he prompted. Thereupon he asked, "Why are the eyes of the Palmyreans bleared?" "My son, you have asked a great question," replied he, "because they live in sandy places." He departed, tarried a while, returned and called out, "Is Hillel here? Is Hillel here?" He robed and went out to him, saying, "My son, what do you require?" "I have a question to ask," said he. "Ask, my son," he prompted. He asked, "Why are the feet of the Africans wide?" "My son, you have asked a great question," said he, "because they live in watery marshes." "I have many questions to ask," said he, "but fear that you may become angry." Thereupon he robed, sat before him, and said, "Ask all the questions you have to ask. Are you Hillel, who is called the Nasi of Israel?" "Yes," he replied. "If that is you," he retorted, "may there not be many like you in Israel." "Why, my son?" queried he. "Because I have lost 400 zuz through you," complained he. "Be careful," he answered. "Hillel is worth it that you should lose 400 zuz and yet another 400 zuz through him. Yet Hillel shall not lose his temper." Okay. The whole story. Now we're going to go back. We'll break it down a little, and then we'll have a brief discussion about what's going on here. Why is Hillel the model? Okay, so back to the beginning. They teach a person should be patient. Just so you know, in Hebrew, there's another connection here to the Jewish value of anava. Anava means humility. So in the Hebrew, there's a link to the word patient, humble, and it's all related to the root anava, this idea of humility. So one should be humble like Hillel, or one should be patient. And so already we have a really important theme about answering a fool or answering someone who's nagging at you is this idea of humility, right? And the way I like to think of humility is it's not removing the ego, but it really is this idea of how much space do you take up, right? And what kind of space do you use when you're in relationship with other people, and how do you use that space, and how do you interact with others? And so I think here we're hearing a story about when there are people who are invading your space, not just physically, but your emotional space. How do you respond to people in those situations? What is the best way to deal with the infringement upon your safe space? And how do you address that, especially when those are people who are purely out to nag you? They are not out to learn at your feet, to learn from the wisdom that you have to offer them. They're coming specifically to cause trouble. And so it's also really important to keep in mind, because this is not the only story that we deal with teachers dealing with nagging students, that this specific case that we're dealing with today, different from what we'll deal with even to next week, is this idea of the purposeful nagging in order to cause angst, anxiety, frustration, anger. That's the type of person we're dealing with here. You don't always know if that's the case right away when you're dealing with those people, but you usually get the idea pretty quickly, right? And so how are you supposed to deal with these kind of people? So it once happened that two men made a wager with each other, saying, "He who goes and makes Hillel angry shall receive 400 zuz," right? So already this is the proof that these are people who are really just out to cause trouble and to troll Hillel. Be like if Hillel was a public figure online today, was tweeting all kinds of things regularly, and these were people who went on to respond to their tweets or go on Facebook and anonymously put out really despicable things in order to try and raise Hillel's anger and to get him to respond in an inappropriate way. Okay, so said one, "I will go and incense him. It'll be me. I'm going to do this." And that day was Sabbath Eve, and Hillel was washing his head. All right, so we're already now getting, this is not just a normal everyday experience. It's not a Tuesday. This is Hillel, a major rabbinic figure, getting ready for Shabbat, getting ready to transition himself into another space for the next 24 hours, right? And he's in a ritual process. We talked earlier about ritual with the 17th of Tammuz, this idea of ritualizing moments, right? He's washing his head, he's purifying himself, he's getting ready for Shabbat, and already in this state of trying to make it into a more peaceful place. So already we can think about, now it's not just those moments where someone is coming after us, so to speak, but it's in those moments where we are feeling really peaceful in a place of feeling very secure, right? When your guard is down, so to speak, that's when this is happening. When you're least expecting it, that's when they're coming at you and just trying to bring you down and to bring all kinds of things that just infuriate you. So this man comes and he passes by the door of his house and he's yelling out, "Where's Hillel? Is Hillel here?" So Hillel, for the first time, puts on his robe and he goes out and says, "What do you require? What can I do for you?" And he has a question, and he asks this question about why are the heads of the Babylonians round, right? A totally random question. It's not a question even about Shabbat. It's not a question about halakha, Jewish law. It's a purely random, irrelevant, unnecessary question, especially given the time of the week, right? And Hillel, who is a well-learned man, is here getting ready for Shabbat, and now this person's asking this kind of ridiculous question, bringing up the most insane, ridiculous thing when I'm in a state of peace and I'm making a transition to another kind of spiritual framework for my life for the next 24 hours, and you're asking me this? Are you kidding me? Right? That's how we would want to respond. But here, he says, "Well, what can I do for you?" Yes, he asks this question, and he actually gives a legitimate response. He tries to answer this person, right? And not necessarily in a snarky way, but he responds by just going with it. Then the man leaves, he waits around a while, and then he returns again, and he calls out, and Hillel comes out now a second time. And now this guy asks a second ridiculous question about the eyes of the Palmyreans. I didn't do enough research on those, so you can do your own research on the Palmyreans. Why are their eyes bleary? It's because they live in sandy places, right? So he finds even to a ridiculous question, he finds some kind of response, right? And it doesn't take him a lot of time. It doesn't say that he sat for a long time. He figures out a way to respond, to end the conversation and be done with it, but to do so in a respectful way. The man again leaves now for the second time. "What do you want?" He comes back again. Now he asks about why the feet of the Africans are wide, another ridiculous question. And you can assume even that these questions are not even based on fact. Another key thing in today's world where we talk about truthiness or what's a fact. And false truths and all kinds of and fake news, all of these things. Even here, when someone is bringing him something that we could assume both as the reader and we can assume Hillel knows is completely not true and not real at all. Even when those questions are brought forth to him, even when those kinds of conversations that you have, that you in your mind know are just so insane, he still comes with an answer because they live in watery marshes. And then the man says, I have so many questions, but I fear I might make you angry. It's almost now as if this man is transitioning into his approach because he came out really strong trying to anger Hillel. And is he now suggesting, now has Hillel maybe subdued this man's attempt at the beginning? Has Hillel's process of how he has responded to this man helped move this man away from being a troll to maybe being a slightly different person? You can ask yourself that question. Thereupon he robed and he sat before him. All the questions you have, ask. So Hillel, here it is, Friday night, he's getting ready for Shabbat, and this man who's now asked him 3 ridiculous questions, right? He has responded to all of them, and now he's even on top of that saying, go ahead, I'm here, ask away. And then the man asks, are you Hillel? He's just confirming that this is the man that he was, he did the bet against. And yes, he said, and if that is you, this man said, I hope there are not many like you in Israel. By the way, if you remember, the last time we heard that when we studied together was the story of the ugly man. Remember the ugly man in the story there, there's a rabbi and an ugly man. And there is the line, may there not be many like you in Israel, when he's referring to the rabbi. So why, my son, queried he, because I have lost 400 zuz through you, right? So now the man whose goal was to really infuriate Hillel, he failed and he lost the bet. Be careful, says Hillel. So right now Hillel is giving this man a warning. So he's dealt with him, and now he's coming back and saying, be careful of how you interact with other people. Be careful, because in other words, not necessarily everyone's going to respond like Hillel will. Hillel is worth it that you should lose 400 zuz and yet another 400 zuz through him, says the rabbis, the Talmud, yet Hillel shall not lose his temper. Okay, so he won't lose his temper. Humility. How do we respond to trolls? How do we respond to people who, in our place where we are feeling really just calm, infuriate us and start to push our buttons? This is an ideal. I would say this is about the virtue of how you answer. In other words, there's a recognition that we can't all be like Hillel. We can't all answer all the time like Hillel does to this man. But there is this idea that this is what we should strive for, that the Talmud is suggesting, as unrealistic as it may feel sometimes, that this is the way we're supposed to approach those who nag, those who try and undermine us, those who try and push our buttons, those who bring to us questions, comments, facts, or perspectives that are so out of line with reality, and especially our reality, that how we respond to them is so important. And it's not the questions that they ask, but the onus is on us to figure out how we are going to give a sense of humility, of anava in those moments. So it's a pretty straightforward story, but I'm curious, what else comes to mind for you when you read this story, especially given what we're going through today? For me, it's this reminder that I need to continue to take deep breaths, that even in those moments where I am feeling like I can be calm and there are those things on the news or things on social media that really irk me, that again, as we've talked about before, what are the questions that we can ask? In this case, Hillel asks, what can I do for you? And he responds in turn in a way that's calm and respectful, even though the person is not being respectful to him. Very hard for us to do. Not always something we can do, but again, something that we are supposed to strive for. And I think in our time right now, we all need to be striving for that. We are going to miss the mark. There's the whole sense of al-chet, missing the mark is going to happen over and over again, but can we really try and do this? Okay, so let's get to your thoughts, comments, questions, etc. Gary raised his hand. So go ahead, Gary. Hi.
So I think what this does for us is it's a test. You know, we are tested in life at different times. We're tested in business meetings. We're tested in social media kind of situations where we read something and you're saying to yourself, how could my friend ever think that kind of thing? And that's kind of how I relate to the text a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. How can that person be thinking this way, right? We don't hear Hillel's inner dialogue and how and what he's thinking in his mind. But like most things in our tradition, we're really about how we act and not necessarily what we're thinking. We can think whatever we want. It's how we then respond and how we act, whether through our voice or through our physical actions. So, right, it's how do you translate those moments where we have our internal dialogue, and can we create the filter, maintain a filter from that internal dialogue to what actually comes out of our mouth in a way that can be productive, right? And that in a way that puts us in a position where we're not trying to overpower the other person who is in fact playing a game of power, right? We had the story of Korach recently, and this idea of a power struggle between Korach and Moses, and that arguments that are for the sake of power versus the sake of truth. And here, how do you make sure that you maintain this idea that power is actually found more in humility than it is about trying to fight power with power in a certain way? So thank you, Gary, for that. Yes, Steve. Hi, Steve.
I'm thinking that quite possibly it has to do with the fact that this happened on Shabbat, and that Hillel was in was in a place of in a special spiritual place that allowed him to respond the way he did, and that's a goal. It doesn't have to be just on Shabbat, but maybe for Hillel it was related to Shabbat.
Okay, good. So that there was something about the state of mind that he was in that allowed him to answer these questions. Now, there are two ways you can take that. Either one, we can't always be in a state of Shabbat preparation. So we have to figure out a way to maybe hold on to a Shabbat mentality in those moments where we are going to be pursued by trolls or people who are trying to, and give us anxiety or angst. Or maybe it's that the way in which we respond is very much in line with the environment in which we're in our own state of mind. And we have to be very aware of where we are emotionally and psychologically when we are faced with situations like this. Because we have to be in tune with ourselves, that part of recognizing if humility is about the amount of space we take up and how we take up space in the world, then we always, that requires us to be grounded in the kind of space that we're in ourselves, and not to be floating off all over the place, but to really understand what it means to be a grounded person. And right now is a really good time for us to be practicing what it means to feel grounded and what it means to be grounded in our home. But then when we start to go out more, how do you find that grounding again? Thank you. Merle. Hi, Merle.
Hi. So I'm thinking more that it's more than just Shabbat, and it is Shabbat and it is a test. But having spent my whole life in some sort of Jewish communal service and being prepared for answers, being prepared for stupid questions, I hate to say it that way, or comments all year round, no matter what the program or event is, that I'd have to realize that I can't shove it into the phone or the TV. I mean, I'm more grateful that most of it was on the phone than in person, because they didn't have to see my facial expressions to respond to it. But I don't think we can pass the test or make it to Shabbat without the realization that this is what we have to deal with, no matter what the profession is, what the business is, or whatever in our lives, and that we have to be prepared for it the minute we walk into that work situation.
Nice. Yes. And I love that it's almost that preparation for the ultimate Shabbat, right? If Shabbat is a time in our lives where we can be at peace, where, Shabbat Shalom, Shalom is this idea of Shalom, of wholeness, that if on the cusp of what it means to be living a life of peace, a life of rest, that's devoid of anxiety and negativity, that on the cusp of that moment is really our ability to respond like Hillel to the world. If we can figure out how to respond to the world like Hillel does, we are that much closer to moving into a space of Shabbat in our lives, right? And that could be another way of understanding this as well. So thank you. Jody. Hi, Jody. Jody,
Sorry, I had a mute issue.
Okay.
I keep wanting to say long time listener, first time caller. This story feels very relevant for exactly the reasons that you quoted about social media and responding with kindness. And but I'll tell you what really also stood out to me in the very beginning. There's this binary announcement about the patience of Hillel and the impatience of Shammai. And Shammai is like, I don't know, the Jewish boogeyman. He never wins an argument. He's always on the wrong side. And I don't know that this story even needed a mention of Shammai. And that is something that stood out to me, was like, this is a beautiful story about Hillel's extraordinary level of patience. Why was it important to point out that Shammai doesn't have that?
That's a great point. Okay, good question. My initial thought is that there are a variety of ways in which we decide to lead, right? Hillel and Shammai were two leaders, just like Korach was a leader and Moses was a leader in different ways. That there are a variety of ways in which we can understand what it means to lead and how we lead. And that the Talmud is trying to recognize that there are different ways in which you can lead. And as we're going to see next week, we're going to see that Shammai is still a leader, but he has attitude, and he doesn't have the kind of patience that Hillel has, but he still has an entire school of rabbinic thinking. So it's not that he's irrelevant. And so here, I on one level, I think this is the idea that when you think about how you want to lead, how you want to understand what it means to be humble in this world and to find leadership through humility, that Hillel is the guide for you. That impatience would have led, I think, to a very different, we're supposed to, I think, imagine, the rabbis are helping us by creating that contrast in the beginning and never mentioning Shammai again. We are supposed to imagine what would happen in the scenario if we were to write our own midrash to this story and Shammai meets this guy. What would have happened? And as we'll see next week with how Shammai relates to some of the converts who come to him, we can imagine it would have ended in a violent way, physically and verbally, right? And so I think it's a reminder that there's a piece of us that is like Shammai, right? There's a piece of us who doesn't want to be patient. There's a recognition in the very beginning of the story, you are faced with a real dilemma here. You are dealing with people who are just trying to cause problems and be a real pain. And you are going to try and be like Shammai, because that's the human nature. We're in those situations, especially when you're feeling really just chill, all of a sudden that happens, you are going to want to pounce. But don't do that. Instead, remember Hillel and don't fall into the trap of Shammai. So I think that's how I'm reading why they included Shammai at the beginning of the story here. Thank you for bringing that up. Gary, I don't know if your hand was still up because you had another question, comment.
I have another comment.
Yeah.
I take this into a different direction completely. Pre-COVID, I was a pretty active tournament poker player. And when you're sitting with 10 people at a table for 10 hours playing in a game and interacting with everybody and reacting to everybody, the whole idea of patience and keeping yourself kind of straightforward, I can relate that to this discussion of Shammai and Hillel very closely. Like, what do you do to keep yourself focused and not get upset with someone's comment or someone gets angry with you when you're playing and things like that? Very interesting kind of concept.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'll make sure never to play poker with you, since you would probably destroy me. All right. Thank you for that. Pamela asks a question in the Q&A. She said, is there a line that Hillel would draw, though? Sometimes are we supposed to not respond? Very good question, right? What is the line? Is there a line by which, this man could have crossed that Hillel would have just not answered the question? that's a great question. And I think there probably is a line. We are not supposed to be completely devoid of a sense of morals or a sense of values when we're interacting with people who seem to be in complete contrast to our set of values. So yes, we could imagine that there probably is something. I would have to do some research to see if in the stories throughout the Talmud, if there is a line that Hillel isn't willing to cross, where there is a boundary. But yes, there probably is. And I guess what I hear underneath your question, Pamela, is the idea that we have to understand what our own lines are, right? And that according to this story, our lines need to be a lot further than we may draw them initially. We may draw our lines, I don't think it's a mistake or just random that this guy comes back multiple times, right? I think it's 3, right? One, two. I think he asks 3 questions, which we know is also a nice prequel to what we're going to experience about the idea of the converts who come next week, because there is this tradition that you are supposed to be rejected a few times when you want to convert, and then after the 3rd time you can go through the conversion process traditionally. But I think it's this idea of raising that level of anxiety and anger and impatience within you. It's happening over and over again. This is not just a man who comes one time to Hillel's door and asks a ridiculous question. It's an elevation of that desire to be impatient and to fall into the trap of being like Shammai. And here the text is teaching us, you thought your line was here, push it a little further. You thought that was the line, you need to push it even further. And when you do that, you actually have the potential of maybe shifting that relationship, right? I think that's another important piece here. It's not that this man then fails the questions and then just walks away or yells at Hillel. It almost as if there is the potential where their relationship could shift, where this man could become a student of Hillel, right? And that a conversion of ideology, a conversion of relational interaction, and how one who may begin in a certain way can go through a process of tshuva, as we think about the high holidays coming up. So I think it is about a line. It's recognizing the story is not letting us know what Hillel's line is, but it is telling us you need to understand what your line is, and you should push it a little more. Test yourself to be able to be a little bit more patient and humble than you may initially have thought. And can we continue to work on that? Can we each be exercising that muscle of what it means to not jump into the defensive and the violence, verbal violence, emotional violence, whatever it may be. And instead, can we continue to draw those lines? And if we all could do that, if we could model that, and if we could all be working on that, how that could change the ways in which people interact with one another, right? Because at the end of the day, the Talmud and these rabbis are looking about how do we create a society that is values driven, that is meaningful, that is relational, that understands that we are not God, that we have to live all together, Jew and non-Jew, the fool and the rabbi, right? Everyone needs to be in this space, and we need to figure out a way to make it work. And right now, we're all struggling to figure out how the heck is this going to work politically, the perspectives we all have on masks, social distancing, and the lack of unified leadership in our country, which has led to people making different decisions, right? Do you blame them or do you blame the leadership, right? Is it the individual who is making that decision and they're at fault if they do something one way or another, or is it the whole system? We're not going to get into that right now, but these are all the things that come up in the story. So next week, we are going to look at the continuation of this. I've already given a lot of hints about what that story is going to be. And it's not just one convert. So we'll see, it's a longer piece. We're going to look at a few different interactions that Shammai and Hillel have with people who are thinking about conversion. And we'll see how they respond. And we can maybe draw some comparisons and connections to this story and discover some new things as well. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. And appreciate you spending time with me. Again, since it is the 17th of Tammuz, again, I really do urge you in these next remaining hours of the day to think about if there's one way you can ritualize this day in some way, and look forward to seeing you again next week. And an early Shabbat Shalom to you and your loved ones. All right. Bye, everyone.